Good morning and welcome to today's SCI webcast. And we are going to talk about at what point does DevSecOps become too risky for business. And my name is Hassan Yassar. I'm a technical director here at SCI. And today I am joined by Altaz Walani of Security Compass. Altaz, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Hassan, and thanks everyone for attending this webcast. Uh, as Hassan mentioned, I'm the Director of Research Insights at Security Compass. My focus is on collaboration and thought leadership within the industry, where I extensively get together with folks from industry and academia and help to push the body of knowledge forward as it relates to software development and security. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us, Altaz, today. So we will be talking about specifically the business risk and how the business risk become really too risky when we try to go with the DevSecOps concept. But before really starting our talk today, our chat session, I really would like to make our discussion as interactive as possible, so we can address your question. Not really, I know I can, Altaz and I can, we can talk a lot. We have been doing a lot of work together, but really I prefer to have a discussion and through the chat window. If you're on the YouTube channel, you will see the chat window is open, and put your questions so we can answer the questions and based on what you see. Maybe you don't know the DevSecOps, maybe you know the DevOps or something else, we can dive into it. At the same time, try to address your question. Let's make more collaborative. I know we are in the situation and everyone's kind of a stay-at-home situation right now, and hoping that everybody's healthy and safe. But let's have interaction so we can have a good communication throughout the sessions. So what are we going to talk about today? So the main things, and we have been seeing in a problem, and Altez and I specifically, we are working with the DevSecOps and DevOps concept, and we see that people are really ignoring a business risk. It's really a general term, and like everybody's talking about, let's go fast, fast, fast with DevSecOps concept. Let's go and build continuous. Let's build up a new version and deliver quickly on time, or go fast, or automate everything. But we often ignore the business risk side of it. So we're going to cover up to what the business risk mean in the context of DevSecOps. It is not just the limit to the security, like what are the business risks? I know we would like to do business value, that what the DevOps means, right? We could like get the business value, we're going to deliver the any features that really align with the business goals, business objective. But end of the day, we have to do the business risk also should be part of it too. So we're going to cover up the, what the business context means, and we're going to cover up the managing risk gap through the DevSecOps pipeline. Like how can we get the business risk throughout the DevSecOps pipeline, understand what the DevSecOps pipeline means, what the other important elements are, what the characteristics of the pipelines are, and how we can add the business risk into the pipeline. So first question to you, Altaz, what are the really challenges that you see in the business risk when you compare the DevSecOps? Can you dive into what the business really wants, and what the business wants to achieve with respect to the DevSecOps or the continuous delivery pipeline?
Yeah, that's a really key point, Hassan. And even as you and I have chatted over several months, it really is something where we have to clearly define what we mean when we talk about risk in terms of the business context. So typically, when we look at the business, they're trying to address risk from three different perspectives. On the first hand, they're trying to look at it from a cyber resiliency perspective. How can we provide assurance to the business that if there's an ever this opportunity that we get breached, what are we now going to do to recover quickly from that? The second is looking at it from a compliance perspective, and this will generally apply most of the time to companies that are in highly regulated industries. But is there a breach if we were to do something in DevOps? For example, if it turns out that we've got a particular security vulnerability that makes its way over into production, what does that now mean if we ever get audited in the future? And of course, there's the third area, which is the classic area on managing revenue and cost. So, looking at each of these three buckets, right? Cyber resiliency, compliance and regulations, and then the third bucket being revenue and sort of the operational costs. The challenge that we've seen historically is many times DevOps teams will come back and try to converse with the business in very process centric terms. So it will be things like, we completed X number of sprints and did, Y number of releases. And that's not really what the conversation from a business standpoint is about. The value comes in terms of how are we managing this risk? Is doing this going to reduce our risk? Is it going to help us manage our risk? Is it going to help us transfer our risk? And when we look at the DevOps pipelines and the DevSecOps pipelines, the thought is rather than it becoming a black box, we want to be able to radiate information back to the business so that they are able to go in and make informed decisions about how they're going to help manage risk. So typical questions would be things like what we just discussed. When we get breached, how are we going to handle it? Can we do it quickly? How are we doing things as efficiently as possible so we are not stopping security
Right.
from helping us generate revenue? So these are the kinds of concepts that need to emerge, Hassan.
You said a couple keyword, Altes. Let's expand that keyword, such as like a cost and revenue, and also the cyber resilience and compliances. When I see the typical organizations, when they really implement it, they're looking for just the security elements only. I know we have to the security, of course, we have to have a securities in place, but what is the cost is important, seems to me. Like, what is the value that we would do security analysis, an example? What is the cost that features should be part of our business that we're delivering to the future wise? And also, how can we get a compliance? It's a really good point for compliances. More often, a lot of organizations are ignoring compliance perspective. That's the basically question you're asking, and what point will become a risky? The question is, it is risky if you don't really address the compliances, like if you ignore the compliance perspective. If you ignore the business revenue and cost, will be a risky. If you ignore the resilience, it will be a risky. That's actually the turning point. When it becomes risky, when you ignore all these three buckets of the work, will be a risky, right? That's what we are
Yeah,
trying to address the questions. Like, it is going to be risky of what? If you know it will be risky. If you don't have a proper compliances perspective, it will be risky. Let's open up the compliance, Altez. And compliance seems a driving point, like in terms of the HIPAA or the SOX or the GDPR as an example. Do you see any value, like how the GDPR is affecting the DevSecOps perspective, and how can we
yeah,
get that right?
yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. So when we talk about compliance and audit and that domain, um, historically, teams that have focused just on the technical components of the CI/CD pipeline haven't really looked at some of these issues. And one of the areas of research that you and I have also talked about, Hassan, is what about the intersection, not just of security, but also of privacy with the SDLC? And what about ethics and the SDLC? So this is a rapidly evolving space. What we traditionally thought was just a technical endeavor is in fact moving into the realm of the business now. So when we talk about compliance, we are in fact witnessing today the convergence of compliance and regulations with software development. And so the SDLC is in fact becoming something that helps to manage compliance on an
Mhm.
ongoing basis, right? Now the challenge that we have and the discussions that we've been having, Hassan, is how do we continue to provide, if not real time, at least near real time analysis of our security posture and compliance gaps to the business. So really, this is where compliance begins to come in. When we take a look at GDPR, for example, and we're dealing with privacy issues, when a developer is looking to create code and they're creating code around this, how are we injecting some of those privacy requirements into the pipeline in a way that is seamless and doesn't feel like it's interrupting the developers from doing what they need to do?
Right, like SDLC, it's a key point. When you talk about SDLC, it is a software delivery process, and we have a phases. We often ignore the phases in software lifecycle. We're just saying it's going to happen randomly. It is not. There is a phases in lifecycle. That's reason we have to look at what phases in the life cycle, and we can insert a compliance perspective, like GDPR is a good point. Article, if I'm correct, Article 14 and then 42 and 14 are specifically asking some artifacts with respect to the privacy. How you handle the privacy, how you handle the data has been handled with the developers and architects and designer. So which is requiring to look at the overall perspective in the life cycle. So when we open up the life cycle a little bit, like SDLC, you said software development life cycle, we have the feature request and we have the requirements and design. And so we have the development and testings, and also we have the deployment phases. So each of the phases, actually, there are some certain features we have to do, right? So we have to have some the requirements with respect to the compliances. So we have the design elements, what we need to design with respect to the compliance as an example, and then how can we code into our code phases and test phases so we can validate the code based on the compliance perspective so we can generate the right artifacts. So all these things actually can happen with the DevOps concept. So when we look at the DevOps overall, the big pictures, DevOps is giving us a good feature deployment. It is giving us iterative incremental development phases. It is giving up automation almost every phase in the life cycle. It is giving a continuous feedback. It is really giving us right metrics and measurement. But the key question here, how can we insert a compliance perspective? How can we insert all the business risk into the life cycle? What the requirements are in the business perspective, with the compliance perspective, where we can insert that into the life cycle. That's really a question, so we can really understand what the business we are in, what type of risk we're associated, what the compliance we're associated, we can insert it. Let's dive
Yeah,
into, yeah, what do you think about Alt as another example? Like, how can we get a business risk into the life cycle?
yeah,
Let's,
yeah. That's a good point. I think, Hassan, there are three key things to think about here, right? First of all, we historically have seen that security teams or privacy teams, or software development teams, have largely been working in isolation. We
right,
need to be able to sort of bring these teams together. So, one way of achieving this would be, for example, to get champions from each of these domains to start to talk to each other. And so, for example, if we've got a security or a privacy requirement from a business perspective, sitting together with somebody like a security champion, for example, to understand what this means and how we translate the high level business requirement or something that came from a standard, like a clause from a standard, into actionable software development activities, I think is really necessary. So we need this translation layer to happen, but as well, along with that, we need the traceability that exists between the two. So once the software development pipeline is complete, then by checking it as saying we are now done with this activity, it should tie back to the original clause in the standard to say we have now completed this, and thereby provide the business back with information on how much we have actually achieved for a given standard or regulation. Now, in true DevOps form, this carries on. And if we find something even in production, for example, there has to be a feedback mechanism back into both the software development pipeline as well as
right.
on the business side to help us to now continually refine this over time. And so what we originally thought as being just the software development lifecycle with the necessary artifacts in there, the artifact fabric has now expanded to include what is now also happening on the business side with like a compliance or regulatory standard or something like that, to suggest that in real time we should be able to assess where we are with those as well.
I'll just a couple point. I'm gonna open up your session. You said like let's get the requirements into the issue tracking system, an example, but and also requiring a continuous feedback throughout the life cycle. To achieve that continuous feedback or to achieve the requirements traceability, it is really requiring to establish a right DevSecOps architectures in DevSecOps environment or DevOps environment. So like a deployment pipeline should not be just limited to and just limited to the CI and CD perspective. Like if you have a continuous integration or a continuous delivery, and like having a build all the time or delivering all the time, so we are not doing the DevOps technically. We are having a limit to have a business traceability. It is requiring a right pipeline. So it is requiring the right pipeline from the beginning of the pipeline when we get the requirements, when we get the requirement traced through the pipeline. So it is requiring to build up a right architecture of the pipeline. So I'm going to open up to what the typical characteristics of the pipeline it is. And then, so the pipeline should have at least issue tracking systems, right? If you are building a business case like how we're writing a case for any features, that has to be as part of our the issue tracking systems. So when we have issue tracking systems, so when we write the code as a developers or architect or designer together, so we're expecting business folks also, and business folks can be really part of the work through the pipeline as well. Like I'm going to create my case, here's my case, and then developer are working on it. So we start from issue tracking systems, then we have a repository management. So we have the build process, we have deployment process, and then we have a feedback. That feedback really getting throughout the pipeline, feeding back to the business team. So it is requiring a right architecture of the pipeline. Without having a right architecture, will be very difficult to achieve the business continuity. So let's give more example, Altes, like how we get a business risk, then we write it. Now, what type of artifact is required to generate through the pipeline with the compliance perspective? Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So now, as you were alluding to, when we have various pipelines beginning to intersect, we've got the software development pipeline, we've got a compliance pipeline, we may have a legal and privacy pipeline, for example. As these all begin to interact with each other, it will become necessary to go in and to make sure that what is the input for one, and it goes through its specific process, becomes a valuable output for something else that is going to be used downstream. And so what we really are looking at now is, first of all, we have to get out of the mindset that we are going to create static artifacts where we've got a beginning and an end. The minute we start to step into DevOps, the whole idea that all of these artifacts that we create have an end state is really something that we need to reconsider. It now becomes every artifact that we create is a living, breathing document of some type. So our requirements are continuously being refined. We've got our build is being refined. We've got our output is being refined. So to get the stuff into the pipeline, first of all, we need to expect that even after we've gone through the pipeline and we've achieved what we want at the end of it, we may need to come back and revisit what we have done as part of ongoing continuous MVP deliveries. And so the thought here is, when we look at injecting something into the DevOps pipeline, we can't lose track of the fact that we are doing this incrementally. So it's not that when we put stuff in, we're trying to get all the requirements about everything, right? There are some decisions and some requirements that are still ambiguous. But as part of an MVP delivery, what is it that we do know today? And how far can we take it based on the knowledge that we know at this point in time? And I think this is where some of the learning happens as the interaction occurs across these various teams. So you talked about injecting this, for example, into an issue tracking system. Putting this into an issue tracking system in a way that the developers can understand, but still at the same time making sure that we have visibility at a higher level to say this issue traces to this particular compliance requirement or audit requirement, I think is necessary. That's how we achieve this. It's by getting the teams to work together, but also making sure that we have this sort of factory of artifacts that are all the time being assessed from the perspective that they are all live at this point. And that's how we go in with that kind of a mindset.
That's good. Thank you, Altes. So I'm looking for the YouTube channel, and participants, please put your questions in the YouTube. So we have a couple questions in the YouTube channel. So let me read it, one of them. The question is, isn't the purpose of DevSecOps continuous feedback loops that are intended to mitigate deployment and risk associated with the big bang deployments? You want to take on it, Altes?
Sure,
They ready
sure.
to action?
Absolutely, absolutely. So yes, that is a part of what DevOps and DevSecOps is supposed to do. We are trying to avoid something where we go with the big bang deployments. We're trying to do this incrementally. There may be some areas where you have to wait and you can't deploy because in deployment you may be in breach, for example. So I think some of these things, there is a balance in between. Trying to do things continuously without assessing what the business risk is, I think is where some of the problems we've had historically emerge from. But the thought is we are not trying to get all of the requirements up front. Then we're going to do all of our pen testing up front. Then we're going to do all, that kind of a model generally becomes very slow over time. It doesn't scale up effectively, but still keeping it incremental, at least getting it to the point where we've got CI. We may not get to a continuous deployment into production on an ongoing basis, but at least having releases that are ready to go incrementally, I think would be a good step. Hassan, you're welcome to provide your thoughts as
I
well
think
on this.
another things we would like to expand. Yes, it's completely. We should have a feedback mechanisms through the pipeline. But important factors, feedback should be on time, and should be feedback delivered to the right people in the pipeline. So it is
Mhm.
not just broadcasting to the mass mailing to everybody. It should be timely and should be relevant to the context. With respect to the business risk, we would like to have the compliance auditors or maybe have the risk team, and if the organization risk management team, they should be part of the chat environment. So let's make it more practical. Like if I'm generating a test result, if test result has about 50 pages, it is very difficult to consume that test pages or reports. And if developer's perspective should be more about like in a digestible format with the risk team, with the developers, and with other team members should be on time, should be relevant to the work that they are doing it. So often when we generate a lot of feedback mechanism, we are generating so much data. We are not really targeting the right people. We're not really targeting the right audience. So it is becoming a kind of like a not a purposefully ignoring any of the message. It's becoming like, hey, if I have too much information that I'm keep getting it, I'm going to ignore it because I don't see a relevance to me. I think giving a feedback to the relevance is important. So another things I have been hearing a lot, if we are running a specific, as an example, like a pen testing result when you run it, that really generating about 50 pages of report. And how you expect that the engineers will digest that 50 pages of report and address any issues in that report. And same thing for audit perspective, and same thing for compliance perspective. So feedback should be more relevant to the work, I believe.
Yeah,
So we
yeah,
have
and
another.
it's sorry, Hassan. Just wanted to
Yeah,
add. I mean,
please.
I think we're witnessing as well. Historically, we saw these as inherent trade-offs. You
Mhm.
either are able to move quickly, or you can be secure. And it was one or the other. But we are at a stage in the industry now where we have to consider both. It's not an either or. It's both speed and security. And somewhere in there lies the right balance to help the business from a risk perspective, so that we're not taking on too much risk, and we know that we're able to go in there and balance these two.
Yep, I have a couple of more questions keep coming up. We have a good interaction from our audience of this. It's great. So
Great.
this is actually interesting. And the one question says, if you have a three different pipeline or a single pipeline for three different view, let's say if organization has a multiple pipelines, I know we cannot have a single pipeline. If you have more than pipeline, how is it going to work out? If you have like pipelines of pipelines, how are we going to address
Yeah.
that? Do
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
expect the risk management team will be part of every pipeline? It's not realistic, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. You know why? This is when we talk about scalability, this is the kind of issue that we want to take head on. Uh, it, we can't go in there and have all teams at every point in time injecting themselves at every stage. So we need to reconsider what it means to scale this out. So, for example, from a risk standpoint, it may be that if we are dealing with risk from a compliance standpoint, we will have certain clauses that are absolutely mandatory. We cannot release if we do not meet what these particular clauses state. Now, putting that into a platform that is shareable, and what you were suggesting, Hassan, is getting the right information and radiating that to people at point in time when they need to make a decision is the crux of this whole thing. We want to be able to go in there and to provide this information, and by doing it in a way, in a language that makes sense to that particular audience. So for example, let's say we want to go and we need to make sure that one of the clauses is that we have to have appropriate identity and access management. When it comes to doing things at the developer level, where we're dealing with mobile development, let's say,
Right.
say Android development or something,
Yep.
in order to address that, there are certain APIs that we can use from a technical perspective to ensure that we're meeting the need for identity and access management. So, for example, we will always authenticate every endpoint prior to transferring any data, for example, and we will use this specific API. And if we need to get further, where we get up to multi factor authentication, we might end up using a fingerprint API, for example.
Hmm.
Developers can understand those kinds of concepts, and as they develop according to those needs, now because we already have the mapping that exists from the compliance clause or from the regulatory clause, from the standards to the development space, this is how we scale this out. It's not that every single time we need to have someone come in and re-explain what this means, but because we've already made that investment on what that translation means, we are now able to effectively scale this out. And in fact, once we've done this translation, the scaling factor turns out to be much more efficient than having to go and individually train multiple teams. I mean, imagine if you've got a large organization that might have 50 scrum teams.
Right.
Educating every one of these teams is near impossible. But if you put it in a way, like in a platform that people can understand, and then it goes in and it makes sense in their context, this is what we need to take a look at. And so when we look at multiple pipelines converging, we have a separate issue on deployment and when it's ready to deploy. But at least from a risk perspective, we can tell how much risk we're taking on prior to deployment. What are your thoughts, Hassan?
I mean, exactly. I agree with you, Altez, and I would like to expand a little bit, as you said, like a digestible format. So when we build up a one features of the work that you give an example for the mobile AP as an example. So basically you get the relevant risk for that piece of work needs to be done. So you're basically getting a level of each features that you translate your business risk to the level of the features, and then that feature is done with respect to business risk specifically. So you can kind of like and narrowing to the as specific the work needs to be done. It is not for everything like boil the ocean. So every team knows what the business risk associated with my piece of code, which is like a fingerprint example for mobile code, and then you establish the relevancy of the business risk for that features. Then you basically you're delegating the work to the team. Then we are upscaling the work to the next connection. So next connection eventually in a big enterprise you basically creating a subgroup of the business risk and which each features and can implement it. When you're collecting data from your pipelines of pipeline, every pipeline can generate a set of data. Let's say I'm a risk management person, right? If I'm looking for work needs to be done, and then I can generate the data from the one pipeline, and that's kind of addressing the features in the specific work, then I can look at the another team members are addressing the feature. Basically, every team are handling their own risk and own business risk with the feature they're developing. So it's kind of like a the risk management person's job or business risk person's job to identify what needs to be done. So which basically, as we said, like a DevOps perspective, it is everybody's job to make the job done. It is not my job only; it's everybody's job to think about the DevOps way. If I'm a business person, as handling the risk, I have to really assign what are the possible risks needs to be done. So I give it to the team member so team can achieve it. So and then eventually can collect the data from the pipeline's perspective.
Yeah. And so
So
sorry, just
yeah,
one
go ahead.
comment. So what ends
Sure.
up happening then, as we extend this further, we we see these various pipelines integrating with each other. But when we, spin up a project now, what we need to do is we've got this template that we can use now. And so we take it and put it in context of the current project. So the thinking has gone from single pipeline to multiple pipelines to a factory model. And you instantiate that factory based on the context that you're dealing
Right. And also every pipeline is generating data. So we have to be aware of the the data collection as well. We cannot ignore it. So we have to really collect what type of data is important with respect to the business. So every pipeline is generating a sort of data. We have to really collect the data from each of the pipeline and then scale up to another pipeline. Eventually, we have a collection of data from different various of pipeline, different features. We can visualize it and share it all the stakeholders. So that's really a way we can collect the data. If I'm auditors and then I should generate data from my repository management example, I can generate data from my build store as an example. I can generate data and share it amongst the team members. So there's another interesting question, Alt. It's a great discussion, by the way, so far. It's a great interaction. So one of the questions that I'm hearing from our participants, they were saying if there is a new function has been generated, and do we have to look at the previous function has been tested before? So how is going to run the new function versus the previous code? Like basically new code versus old code, do we have to retest again? How the risk is going to test for the new features or the updated features in the application, then how we address the continuous risk for a changing.
Yeah, yeah. This is where
It's changing, depends on the work,
yeah,
like depends on it may change.
totally. So there are a couple of nuances to this question, I think. Say we've got a brownfield application and we are now adding some sort of greenfield functionality on top of that. Something new, say microservices around a legacy application or something like that, for example. Um, we can't go back and retest everything that we've done historically. It's cost prohibitive. I mean, if for a very large application, we may not even know everything that we need to effectively test. So what I would suggest is, first of all, consider what are the key processes from a business perspective. Make sure those are secure, right? And then what you want to do is for each new piece of functionality that you add, make sure that you're testing that from a security perspective. Now, as you refine the application, you will have regression issues. There's no question.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start to open up regression issues, we've known this problem around regression for a very long time, and there are many different approaches. Some teams take regression from the perspective of it's always going to be test everything all the time. In some cases, that may not be possible. It just takes too long. There are plans and mechanisms that you can put in place to determine the radius of the functionality that you're looking at, and from that standpoint, test only that which is essential to the changes that you've made. It can be difficult if you're looking at it, for example, with object-oriented code languages, and because everything is ultimately a hierarchical construct. But you should be able to construct, things that are changing and things that have been relatively stable over time. And in doing so, you are now able to contain the amount of time and investment you're going to make from a regression perspective. And ultimately, when you look at the business, one of the things we talked about at the beginning of this conversation is DevSecOps or DevOps going to be slowing us down? So if
Right.
we are doing a regression model where it's test everything all the time and you've got multiple pipelines, this is going to come to a grinding halt, right? So there has to be a better mechanism to go in there and curate our test cases so that from a regression standpoint, even when we go in there and we conduct our testing, we are creating our test cases not explicitly for the need to go in there and conduct immediate automation, but we are doing it, in fact, for reusability. And there's a reframing here again. When we talk about this continuous fabric of the artifact,
Right.
when we look at the
Right.
test cases, this is another thing. How are we going to reuse this? Because we should anticipate that there may be some changes coming at some point in the future. So those would be my thoughts that I would put around this. What about you?
Let's get more specific to open up that topic. That's actually the core of our discussion so far, and we are to find out the solution. What is when we become a bit risky or any type of risk situation. Let's be more specific. So you said like the new code changes or the new feature changes. I think when you give an example, we could have to create what the business requirements are with the business risk requirements are as part of our issue tracking systems, right? Now, when the developer commit the code into the repositories, so typically the Scrum Master or the Agile team or whoever is really managing the work, and they're going to run a bunch of tests and they will say done as an example. So that will go to our build server, which is Jenkins an example. We can give like there are many other build servers. When we build the code, and we can address any security testing, maybe any type of compliance testing. Maybe we are writing a code, that code is requiring some compliance the perspective, like maybe looking for the code artifacts or dependencies. So we can really run a compliance check with the code itself at the moment, right? That's going to feed back to our risk management dashboard. If we should monitor that actually. So how we are monitoring our case, we should monitor the risk related to the work that we are building. We can monitor that. So when we build up to the build server, we'll generate either the test result from the build server, maybe using a static analysis code, maybe using other type of analysis tools. Will generate the data for us. That should feed back to the business risk dashboard or business risk the management portal somehow. So usually when we see the old DevOps pipeline, we ignore that elements. We are not controlling the business risk dashboard. It is kind of siloed somewhere else. What we control, we are controlling the management of the issues that we created and then the features which is associated together. So we have a traceability perspective. What we are seeing it here, we have to generate the artifacts from the build server that's going to feed back to the business management portal. So business manager or the risk person will see, did we address the business risk associated with that features? Even the build server probably done with respect to the testing, but end of the day, a business person should call out, yes, it is addressed properly or not. If it is not, we can force back to the build process and block the build and let address the proper risk has to be done associated with the features that we are building, right? So that can be done multiple ways. Either we can break the build, or we can generate a new ticket to the case management systems. We can force back the changes to the developer, say, I knew you have completed, but still work needs to be done. Here is the things has to be addressed, such as giving a very concrete example, such as maybe you don't have an audit log, audit trial, maybe audit transaction for the future that we are developing. Maybe we're not addressing some other compliance perspective of the work. Maybe in a specific example for the healthcare industry, maybe you're not addressing some PII information related to the context. So this is not actually a test case that you can run it. It is more about how we handle a PII data with the right encryption, and the data has to be in a database. Kind of like a sign of some sort of design component, but how we are handling data segregation, maybe data encryption, and in our writing the code as well. So the feedback should be generated goes back to the business perspective. That's the how we can address the business risk throughout the pipeline, right, Altes?
Yeah, yeah.
Anything?
I think it's worthwhile. You brought up an interesting point here, and we've spoken about this in the past. I think when we traditionally look at the software development pipeline, much of the confirmation or attestation or just approval has gone through in the form of like a checkbox. Did we do this? Check. Developer says I did it, and that check could be in the form of putting it into an issue tracking system and saying this is now complete. But if we want to scale this out, we need, in order to provide assurance back to the business from a risk standpoint, have to consider at least one other mechanism that holds this some accountability to the process. And in the case of like a static code analyzer, as an example, maybe we go in there and we lint the code and we come up with something that comes back and says, hey, I know you checked this in, but the linter found something over here that doesn't make sense. And so now you've got two data points. You've got the developer coming in and saying this was complete, and you've got the automated tool coming back and saying, hold on, I think I found some issues over here. And this makes for some very interesting discussions because you want this kind of stuff to happen. You want to catch these things. And, was it based on the fact that maybe the developer misunderstood something or the developer needs training? Or is it something where we need to tweak and refine the static code analyzer so that
Mm-hmm.
we don't generate these kinds of false positives? But having this level of assurance where we've got not just from a developer's perspective, but also looking at it from an objective, neutral, tool perspective, bringing this stuff in, I think, can add tremendous value because when you talk about ultimately this dashboard, whether it's for someone that's on the compliance or audit side or someone from the risk side, they will inevitably ask the question, how can I trust that this is in fact done? What assurance can you give me? And by
Right.
providing multiple sources of data to them and allowing them to aggregate this in terms of their own analysis, I think is a really important concept. So yeah, I mean, it's great that you brought it up. I agree.
Right, which basically creating a continuous risk throughout the pipeline. It is not specific to the software testing. We are looking for bring that risk assessments into your integrated pipeline. So technically, we are adding another elements into our pipeline, like how we set about issue tracking systems, case management systems, and build server and deployment. We are saying we should have a risk management dashboard for the tools that will be connected to the pipeline. So that's how we can really facilitate that automation of the continuous risk. So that's going to be part of our issue tracking system, will be part of our test cases, will be part of our deployment, will be part of our issue case or case management system, something Wikipedia says as well. So, and how we connect to the pipeline, we're expanding that you should have a risk management tools should be part of your pipeline, right? There are some tools out there. One of the question was asking, and is there any example of automated continuous risk pipeline? Yes, there is possibilities. There are risk management dashboards and tools is available, like the Security Compass and SD Elements is one of them, which is you have it Altes, and some other organization like OSCL is another example. There are examples available in the market, but has to be connected to the pipeline. That's what we are saying it here so far. So in your pipeline, when we have the full pipeline integrated, case management, repository management, all the things, we have to include the risk pieces as well into the pipeline. It is not separated out. Otherwise, it's creating a silo. What we are saying is you should bring into the pipeline should be integrated the case or the requirements. All the pipelines should be interacting each other. End of the day, we have a dashboard. That dashboard will tell us what is our kind of risk posture it is. That's kind of related to the security elements. Yes, it's the three buckets you said at the beginning. We have three buckets. One is cybersecurity related. The other one is the cost and value. The other one is the compliance perspective. Compliance sometimes is not related to security sometimes. Like if you remember the case for the Volkswagen case, I'm sure you remember Altez, right? Volkswagen
Yeah,
case.
yeah, yeah.
There was a good example for compliance perspective. So engineer they have to comply that, but somehow they ignored. It means most likely they don't know the what they have to comply with it. So because it was not in their day-to-day activities, it was kind of high level somewhere else, was not addressed properly, was not monitored properly. So that developer writing based on what the function says, what the security requirements probably, what is the compliance requirements are. That's a key question. What is the compliance perspective? So it has to
Yeah.
be in a digestible way, right? If we have the business requirements that we write it, I think we have to convert the risk requirement as well as part of our business requirements. So risk requirement should be listed which domain we are in, based on the domain, based on the compliances, what is our risk requirement should be in place. That has to be pushed back to the case management as an example, right? If I'm running a features, we have to write what is my risk requirements are for that feature that we are writing. Then we can have a traceability of the requirements based on the risks.
Yeah, I think you brought up an interesting point here. We are trying to get away from silos. And
Mhm.
historically, we had dev and ops teams working together as a way to try and de-silo these two organizational units. But the minute we start to scale this up at the enterprise level, now we are dealing not just with technical teams, but we're dealing with business teams, and these cross-functional teams take on an even greater importance because now we're bringing in risk and we're bringing in security and some of these teams that traditionally reside on the business side, and we still want to be able to do this and scale out DevOps, but the concept that DevOps is going to be just a technical initiative is rapidly giving way to the fact that this is now becoming a not just cross-functional technical teams but cross-functional business units at this point. And to your point, now it's about making sure that we get the right information to the right
Mhm.
business units for them to do what they need to do.
Right. Like we technically we don't want to get the organization are siloed. based on the
Yeah.
tool limitations. So tools should help the organization to enable the communication, enable the collaboration. So if the risk management teams are using risk tools, they have to integrate into their DevSecOps
Yes.
environments. They have to really connect to the DevSecOps environment somehow. I mean, there is no like a major things needs to be done. Somehow, the developer should able to find out how can we link these two tools together so tool will become an enabler for us, not a barrier for us.
Mm.
So what I'm really suggesting the business team, how they are managing their risk, they have to connect their pipeline. And there is a multiple ways and there is a multiple connections should be done in the pipeline. As we said, we have been saying from the beginning, there are multiple ways, multiple connections should be tied into the pipeline that we can have a risk with the business. We have a compliances related with the business, so we can have a full traceabilities, so we can generate it dynamically. So end of the day, actually, the business person will say, "Yet it is done. We deliver the features. We address the business risk associated with the work." Right? Otherwise, and if you're not able to address it, done means it's okay. We complete the features, but are we done with the right way or not? Right?
Oh, yeah.
Done
This is
is changing depends on the who we're asking.
Yeah, yeah. This is really important because when we look at historically how this was done, excuse me, um, we will find that many times, if we approach it from a tooling perspective, we'll suggest, oh, if we just buy this tool, this will help us to be more secure. But when we put that tool in place, then we look at it from a very narrow perspective. And going forward, if we then go back to the business and say, oh yeah, now we need this other tool, the perception can be that we're just chasing another shiny object which isn't really helping the business at the end of the day. So this idea that we have to speak the language of the business and be able to translate our technical activities in a way that the business understands, and at the same time making sure that from a business perspective, they are able to understand the challenges as it relates to a technology or technical layer. I think these are the next set of challenges that are going to emerge. And in fact, we are seeing from a business standpoint, if you look at what some groups like ISACA are doing as an example, they are training the audit and assurance communities to better understand technology so that the audit questions they would ask tend to be much more detailed and specific. So this is already happening when we talk about this and how risk is converging with software development, and at the same time we've
Right.
got compliance being injected in as well. Yeah.
Right. As the compliance checked in, like compliance can be infrastructure level compliance, such as using an open SCAP format, maybe looking for the compliance like a stake format as an example. So compliances can be inserted into the deployment pipeline. So if you have an Ansible playbook as an example, if you have a chef cookbooks and recipes, we can check the compliances with respect to the deployment and the organization we are in. Like almost every tool has that pieces in it. So we have to utilize that tools with respect to compliances we are in and check the configuration as an example. So now we see in multiple places we can check out. In deployment phases, we can check it out with the compliance perspective, and then we can check out the requirements phases and what the requirements are. We can check through the testing phases. Even though we can check for the code practices as well during the code review, we can check it out what we have to do with the compliance perspective. So like we see multiple interaction through the pipeline. That's the reason you said at the beginning we have to integrate through the SDLC. It is not just the one place as the CI server. It should be part of SDLC pipeline, right? So risk management portals or risk management tools should able to interact with the case management, should interact with the build server, should interact with our deployment scripts that we can analyze and collect the data and run through the environments. So we have about almost 10 minutes to go. So what is your suggestion, Altes, for the next steps for the people they would like to do? Let's wrap up our call so far. I know we talked so many great topics. Sometimes it's broad. We're trying to get more specific. Let's give like a couple ideas what we can advise to the folks what needs to be done. Maybe a next month, maybe a 3 month cycle.
Sure, sure. So I think when we look at DevSecOps and looking at rolling this out, One of the things that might be an immediate action that someone could potentially take is begin to rethink in terms of risk. When you do your software development, how are we helping to manage business risk at the end of the day? Are we talking to people who are the risk experts in our organization, and could we bring some of their thinking into our software development pipelines? So look at making risk a first order citizen, just as we traditionally have considered other things, like test cases or things like that,
Mhm.
really being brought and shifted to the left, so to speak. Try to bring risk discussions in earlier. It will help with architectural trade-offs. It will help when doing coding, and you can understand
Right.
from a coding perspective whether you're injecting new risks, and things like that. I think would be a good
So
first step. Go
you're
ahead,
saying
Hassan.
you're saying basically getting a risk team part of our discussions. So we
Yeah.
are expanding the DevOps definition. We are saying the stakeholders. Now we have to add the risk team into our discussion first.
Yes. Yes.
Don't do any work. And then discussion can be part of the project meetings, probably, maybe part of daily Scrum. But if there is a limitation on the staff, probably we can share the a collaboration portal as part of their discussion, right? That's immediate action. Call the
Yeah.
risk team members, work together.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, I mean,
So
it
what is
makes
the
sense, and then we
right,
can sort of begin to report from a risk standpoint at that
right,
point. Yeah.
right, right? This is kind of immediate action. We are saying get the risk team together and have a first order citizens of the risks. And
Yes.
what are the next? What is the next? Let's say we have it now. We have the risk team as part of it. Now we are talking. What's next? What's next we should do?
Yeah. So once we start to talk about risk, and we've got this sense that we're able to converse along the same level when it comes to risk, I think we can expand that further and begin to look at risk more from an architectural perspective. Um, Architectural in the sense that, how do we go in there now and make the necessary translation from what the business is looking for to how the teams are executing from an architectural perspective? Can we generate artifacts in an automated way? Can we go in there and look for the kinds of reports or metrics that we can then roll upwards? So looking at it more from that architectural standpoint and moving away from just looking at that single pipeline and radiating information
Right.
just from a technology perspective.
So basically, we have to convert our risk framework into the digestible format and put into the pipelines. So the framework is maybe requiring a audit log, and
Yeah.
audit generation of audit log as an example. We have to put more a facilitator automation around that generating the right data sets and through the pipeline, so we can feed back to our risk management framework or the compliance framework we have to be on it. So risk team should able to translate that the requirements, the compliance requirements in a digestible format that the team members should be into the pipeline. And then we will decide as no go and go in the deployment perspective, or we will
Yes.
decide like what are the consistent quantitative risk assessments, and we can use it in our pipeline. It was a great discussion so far, Alt. It's about the 5 minutes to go, and we have some questions in the YouTube channel, and we'll try to answer that question, but we don't have enough time to answer all of the questions. I know it's a great discussions. And as last closing things, do you want to say anything else before closing our session, Altes, as they wrap up
Uh,
our talk?
yeah, I just wanted to reiterate. I think that we are at a stage now. It's very exciting in the industry. We are seeing software development is now a critical process within an organization. I mean, every company essentially is creating some kind of software. And the more we can get ahead of this curve now and start to address this critical process in a way that the business can understand, so that they have the assurance, and from an accountability standpoint, because we're seeing like regulatory standards emerging that are holding senior executives in organizations accountable for software development practices. Whatever we can do to help them, I think, is going to make this even more seamless and even more important as time goes on.
Right, exactly. Thanks, Altes. So as the couple of closing comments, and there are many risk management frameworks example available already, and from the NIST 800-37, 800-53, get all this with respect to security implemented the life cycle. Same as true for the HIPAA compliance, same as true for GDPR. Let's look at it and see which one we can implement in our pipeline and automated fashion and control fashions. So with that said, it was a great discussion so far. Thanks for participating our discussion today. And our YouTube channel is live right now as soon as when we are done our session and will be archived. So you can still look at through the SCI, the SCI the channel through the YouTube video. So you can look at the videos later on. But if you still have a questions, and please reach out to us and either info@sci.cm.edu or you can ask the question from the YouTube channel as well, so we'll answer your questions. And thanks for watching us, and I wish everybody safe and healthy with this current situation, and healthy days expecting for us, and we stay together and strong together so we can achieve and we can go forward. Thank you so much.